Thanks again to the usual suspects, the selection committee for a stellar lineup, Barbara Cook for organizing our refreshments, card carrying books and gifts who paid for both our bookmarks and gave a book to each of the presenters, and to Marshall Hyde, who I always forget, for tech support, wherever he is. As I mentioned last week, it's budget time in Albany. That's always exciting for many reasons. And while we were surprised and delighted to have Governor Hochul recommend an almost 2.5% increase in library support, it's really not enough. She's also recommended that construction aid be flat funded. Construction aid has enabled libraries to update. We get it almost every round in Corning. Helped us with the HVAC system, with the Mary Lou Walker room, all kinds of stuff. It also brings jobs to the community. It's just a terrific thing. But libraries have been underfunded and flat funded essentially for at least a decade. So we need your help in changing that. So we're hoping that Governor Hochul raise will be looked at by the legislators and they'll say, well, no, how about a little bit more? So this is advocacy time as well. I have, and if you're on social media, you may have seen pictures of people with this. I have our I Love Library sign. I would love to get pictures of many of you with it. I know I've gotten some of you last week, but I'd love to get some more today. I also have postcards. These will be collected and given to our legislators when we go to Albany to lobby. There's just a place for you to print your name and what county you live in. But there's also a little bit of white space. So if you want to draw a little heart or a smiley face or add a little note, that's a great idea. They're up here on the table with pens. I would love to have you stop by at the end and do one of those. I love what author Neil Gaiman said one year during National Library Week. You should be especially nice to a librarian today or tomorrow, sometimes this week anyway. Probably the librarians would like tea or chocolate or a reliable source of funding. He's also said libraries are the thin red line between civilization and barbarism. This week's book is Necessary Trouble Growing Up at... Oh, wait, I have two more things, housekeeping. We have to put the chairs away again this week. Last week we had a little reprieve. So if you could just carry your chair over here to the chair rack at the end, that would be very helpful. Also, another reliable source of funding for our library for many, many years has been the Friends of the Library, who sponsored this program. Obviously the book sales, which raise a ton of money, which they share with us. So if you have not renewed your membership, Kim is at the table in the back and she will happily take your money. It's a bargain, $5 for an individual, $10 for a family. Okay, today's book is Necessary Trouble Growing Up at Midcentury by Drew Gilpin Faust. We're happy to welcome Dr. Jennifer O'Hara, professor and department chair at Corning Community College. Jen has a BA in philosophy and law and society from Binghamton, a law degree from Western New England University Law School, and a doctorate of education from Vanderbilt. To mix it up a bit this year, I posed some questions I adapted from the New York Times by the book section. It's in the book review every week. In response to what is the first library experience you remember, Jen said, going to story hour with Miss Nancy and reading Dr. Seuss. When I read that, I thought of the hundreds and hundreds of children from the Corning area, many now adults and some bringing their own children, who would say the same, only substituting Miss Sue for Miss Nancy. One of the most important things libraries do is foster literacy and a love of books in our youngest citizens. To describe her ideal reading experience, Jen said, "I love reading in my sunroom with a warm cup of tea and natural sunlight and with my doggo close by." Thanks so much for coming today, Jen. Thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting me to do this. I'm really excited about it, though. I grabbed my book and started feverishly looking for a quote that I had decided not to include as you were talking about Library Week, because I forgot it was such. But there is a quote in the book where Dr. Gilpin Faust says that it is through the miracle of public libraries that she read so much during her summers on the Cape. And I just remember feeling when I read that little bit that, yeah, no, she gets us, right? She gets us. We're her people, or she's our people. So again, thank you. I'm excited to talk about this book. Well, first, before I start, so the title, did it sound familiar to folks? Right? Like, why? Why is it right? John Lewis, right? So is anybody worried about that? Did anybody, and for those who read it, you probably know what I'm driving at here, but is anybody worried that this is John Lewis's phrase, or did it feel like misappropriation or appropriation? Anyone worry? No? Well, I did. I found out very quickly that she got permission from him before he passed, and he knew she was going to title her book this. And so that made me feel a little bit better. But finding about who she was as I moved through the book, I should have realized that that would be the case. I should have known better. So I want to start with something personal before I start talking about the book in general. So my husband and I have this ongoing thing since before we were married, where we have this imaginary dinner where we invite people to come that we think are interesting and would be just great conversation and would light up the room, and it would just feel like, the most interesting and intellectual evening. And it's changed over the years. Like at one point, Andrew Cuomo was on it, not so much anymore, right? So, but my immediate reaction, maybe by chapter 3, I guess it's not immediate if it's chapter 3, is it? But at chapter 3, my thought was, oh yeah, she can come to the dinner. Her life is so very interesting, and she has had so many experiences. And when you think about the fact that the book spans only really her childhood to the end of her time at Bryn Mawr, right? It's pretty interesting that she has so much to talk about during that time period. And yet we all know, I think, that her life after that was pretty spectacular too. And so I definitely felt like whether I liked the book or not, or what she had to say, I certainly liked who she was. And that's always an easier ride when you're reading a long book, right? When you already feel community with the author. So I'd like to read a rather long quote, forgive me, because this particular quote, as I was reading the book, struck me as encapsulating everything I had read thus far. And it's on page 90, so it's only about a third of the way through the book, a little more than that. And I was like, all right, well, maybe things are going to change. So I'm just going to bookmark it and I'll come back. And so then I read another third and I was like, nope, this is still it. And then when I finished, I went back and read it again. And I said, oh yeah, this quote really captures all of the themes from my point of view in the book. So the heart of it is what I called this quote. The civil rights leader, John Lewis, often referred to what he called necessary trouble. I did not have the privilege of getting to know Congressman Lewis until very much later in my life, but I have often thought that his words captured something of the essence of my childhood rebelliousness. It was urgent and imperative. I did not feel that I had a choice. Partly it was that youthful clarity and determination about doing the right thing. But perhaps even more fundamentally, it was necessary for me, necessary to enable me to survive amid the stifling silences that threatened to define my life. I had to make my own kind of necessary trouble, penetrating the blindness and the taken for grantedness of the present and coming to terms with the real meaning of the misrepresented past would become for me the work of a lifetime. And in fact, as a historian, this came to pass. So the themes that I think that the quote aptly captures and that are so connected to the words that appear there are, you can see them on the screen. I'm going to go through them a little bit at a time to talk about some of the things from the book that made me feel that these were strong themes. And then I'll talk about the book more from a high airplane view, an overview of what the course of the book was about. So let me just start with the notion that it was in her mind challenging to be a woman, right? Not surprising, but especially a woman in the era that she was coming of age, right? But what's interesting about the way she wrote the book is that she didn't just speak to that. She spent a lot of time in the early chapters talking about the difficulty of being a woman in the eras before her. So she talks about her great-grandmother, she talks about her grandmother and her mother and some of the things that they confronted. Now, as I'll talk a little bit later, sometimes when she talks, I get, instead of a sense of appreciation and reverence for the struggles they had, more of a disdain for the women that preceded her. And maybe you, if you read it, that didn't occur to you, but that was a very strong message for me. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. One of the themes that comes up routinely with regard to her mother, not herself, which is interesting, is the notion of body image. She opens the book with her mother's death, which they don't find out until later is probably connected to a long battle with anorexia. And at the time that she dies, they think it's something different, but she writes about recognizing how, well, of course, you know, she was always trying to be something that was expected of her rather than maybe what she wanted to be. And then she talks about limitations and expectations, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more too with regard to her mom. The second theme that I mentioned is war and toxic masculinity. So for anyone that read it, did you get the toxic masculinity thing? Anyone that read it? Did it feel, I mean, because I asked another friend of mine who read this probably about a month ago. I said, toxic masculinity, right? And she goes, what? I don't get that at all. I said, really? I had this very strong driving feeling of her connection of guns and war and the way men should live their life to an overarching sense of toxic masculinity. So I like to talk about it because I have a dear friend who I consider brilliant who absolutely disagrees with me, which I think is the fun part of books, right? But there is a strong theme of war in her work. And she talks about a lot about how the men in her chronological history were expected to be soldiers. And even in fact, how one of the women in her history would not consider being engaged to one of the men in her history until he got his orders or his uniform, right? And so she comes from a line of women who look to the male, if you will, stereotype of masculinity as a soldier and always connecting that to their use of guns. I'm going to talk in a bit also about her reverence for her father and the way she describes his use of guns. And so there's a disconnect a little bit between how she sees her own father and his masculinity and the masculinity of the men in her past. What's interesting, I think, as the book moves on and she starts talking more about her own life, that drops out. And so maybe that's why my friend thought, no, what are you talking about, right? That sense of toxic masculinity drops out, and most of the men that she's connected to in her life do not resemble that stereotype or that archetype. So I think that's a pretty interesting theme. And I will apologize because as a middle-aged woman, full on hot flash, apologize. Anyone can appreciate that, right? The idea of a sweater dress was maybe not a good one. So another theme, no surprise either, the idea of the subjective nature of privilege, right? And maybe not recognizing it. As I'm going to talk about when I talk about the things that I liked, she was really upfront about her privilege. right from the get-go, and that probably surprises nobody, right? I mean, again, one of those things that, okay, knowing her public persona, she of course would acknowledge her privilege. But I mean, her privilege was privilege with a capital P, right? Like horse people living in segregated Virginia, right? I mean, and going to boarding schools and summering at Cape Cod. I mean, we are talking capital P privilege. And there are times that I got the feeling that her acknowledgement of the privilege was good, but I felt like, I mean, do you understand really your privilege? And I think that comes from my own lack of privilege. My own growing up in a very blue collar family, first generation college, first person in my entire extended family to go to graduate school, law school, as it was in my case. And so to me, like the world she described was so incredibly foreign, like people who I thought were privileged in my community and in my life. This is another level altogether. And I think there would have been some merit to really talking about degrees of privilege, which really wasn't there. Then the power of knowledge, of telling the truth, right? This is a very strong theme. I am struck by that, as I'll talk about when I get to questions toward the end. I'm really struck by these times and what's going on in the world and on college campuses, and this notion of truth as power and her obsession with it, and her obsession with making sure that people knew the truth in all of the areas of her life. I think the timing is really kind of perfect for a book like this. You know, I'm going to talk about her life in stages, and I leave out the word books, and I do it on purpose because I want to say I'm fighting the word obsession. Obsession wants to come out, and I'm trying to fight it, but why fight it, right? Her obsession with books, her obsession with reading everything she could get her hands on is something that I think anyone who reads this book would expect, right? And so some of the things I wanted to talk about in looking at her life were the things that surprised me. Books did not surprise me. Some of the other things did. This next one, feeling other, is my favorite theme in the book because it resonates tremendously for me. You get a very strong feel right from page 1, and it does not stop until the end of the epilogue, that she has always felt other. You can see that in the quote I just read, right? This sense of needing to do something, this sense of responsibility, this sense that I keep moving away from the microphone. Is it okay that I'm doing that? It just occurred to me I was doing that. I normally pace the front of the classroom. So, but I'm actually really happy my mouth works without walking. Now this is a new discovery for me. So now I know. The hands haven't stopped, but so that's a theme that I really like in the book, and I like how it plays out for her. But I will admit, in the spirit of her honesty, that I felt less than in reading her book. Right? Seeing her otherness and how she acted on it made me call into question my failures to act on the moments of otherness. And I love it when a book does that. I love it when a book makes me introspective and makes me consider the different spots in my life where, okay, there could have been more action there. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. And then the last is the essentiality of activism, right? Main theme of the book. It's all about her activism, and it's meant to be. And it is not a question of, here's, how I became interested in activism. It's more, there wasn't a question. This was going to happen, right? And I think that that's a really prevalent theme, even from when she's a little kid, because as you know, if you looked at the book, I don't think that's me dinging. And if it is, there's nothing I can do about it. If you looked at the book at all, you see that right at the first page, there's a handwritten letter that is hers to Eisenhower that she wrote when she was 9. And it came about because, I'm going to blot again, like I feel dripping, forgive me. It came about because she had been riding in the car with her family's everything man. He was a Black man in segregated Virginia who was her chauffeur, was her caretaker, was their butler, all the things. And I knew I was going to forget how to say his name. It's spelled Raphael, but he pronounced it Rayfield, I think. And the radio is on, and she reports how in her home, there was never like news. They got a ton of magazines, and she could recall with precision where they were kept and how they went around reading them. But she said there was never really any news, like they didn't know what was going on in the outside world. So she's riding in the car and she hears about segregated schools. And she hears about attempts to start to change things. And she hears this news item that immediately makes her sense the injustice in being denied an education because of the color of your skin. So she's a 9-year-old girl writing a letter to President Eisenhower, in segregated Virginia. So the essentiality is not fake. You know from the beginning that this is something that is true for her. Did anyone have any other themes that came to them while they were reading it, if you read it? Is there something? I'm always interested in that because the things that speak to me sometimes may never occur or something might pop out. No? All right, I'll move on then. Oops, what? Yeah, well, that's good. So thinking about what the book is really about, right? What does this book do? It's really the author's life in 3 acts. She talks about her childhood, her education, and her activism. There are moments that they're interspersed, and I think that's a good thing because I think chronological discussion of all the things in her life would have become cumbersome. I think it makes more sense the way that she did a little bit of weaving of both. But one of the things that she does during the part of her childhood is spends 2 full chapters painstakingly telling us about her pedigree, essentially. This is how we know that the men in her life were all soldiers. This is how we know she has an uncle who was killed in World War II. This is how we know, her brother served in Vietnam. I mean, we know that every little piece of her life was intersecting with war genetically back generations, right? And then she also talks about the privilege back generations. This is not something that she's not nouveau riche. This is not recent money. This is very, very old money on both sides of the family. But what gets really interesting is to hear her words or see her words and hear them. I hear when I read. I imagine everybody has their different way that books affect them. I hear and see. And so I often say I hear her words. But when she's talking about her childhood, what I hear mostly is about the arguments over money. And so you get a very strong sense that there is a panic in her family around the loss of privilege. You have to think about the timing of that, right? This is the civil rights era when people are desperately trying to make changes, and then you have old money white people trying to hang on to their power. And this is the quintessential conflict of the time, right? And so this played out in her life very clearly, but she doesn't talk about it at all after the childhood piece, right? It's woven in her childhood, but then it's lost. I just found that interesting. I don't have an understanding as to why. Maybe it wasn't meant to be anything important, but it was something I noticed. I thought that was interesting that her childhood, she could feel the need to hang on to the money. And yet when you look at her teen years and college years, even though I would call those very privileged experiences in her life, there's not much talk about it. So, yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair, Peggy, right? So to talk about the privilege still at that point would probably not be authentic, right? But, and I'm going to talk about this in the questions. And by the way, thank you for just piping in. I love that. No, please do. It's how I run my classroom. I'm typically more Socratic. And so talking this long without getting interaction is really unusual for me. But my husband would say otherwise, by the way. But please, if you have something that I'm saying that you want to address or ask about, you don't need to raise your hand. Just, oh no, except for you. I don't. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
she didn't see her mother. I mean, her mother went to the teachers.
Oh, when she showed up at Bryn Mawr. Yeah, yeah. No, she showed up at Bryn Mawr to challenge some of the freedoms that she had. And the president of the school meets with the mother, basically tells her mother, it's not your concern, right? We are, one of my favorite quotes isn't from Bryn Mawr, actually, it's from Mrs. Hall at the Concord Academy, but it's around how rules take away thinking, right? I got the quote wrong, but that's the gist of it, right? When we create rules, we create people who don't think. You don't have to think, right? And so even though I think there was a stark contrast between Concord Academy and Bryn Mawr, I definitely felt like the head of the school, the president at the time at Bryn Mawr, was very interested in keeping the parents at bay and becoming, as you often hear her say, in loco parentis themselves. And she doesn't even find out until after her mother leaves, and she's thrilled, right? So to Peggy's point, right, she's like, good. And then her mother dies, as she notes. I got rid of her, and then 2 years later she dies. And she struggles with it. So interesting stuff. Yeah. So in thinking about her childhood separate from that, I mean her pedigree, one of the things that surprised me, and I have it there on the screen, is her connection to animals. She was very much comfortable on their farm. Right. She talked about how she raised steers, how she was, how the ducks would come in and out of the house, how that was something that she felt very at home with. And later on, when she starts talking about her reading and the things that moved her as a teenager, primarily she focuses on 3 heroines, but she does talk about the Black Beauty series, right? And the Black Stallion series and the series and all the books about animals from their perspective, and how much that was integrated into who she was as a person. And I felt like it was kind of misplaced. It was, everything else was sort of weaved in, but then we had this animal theme. And I loved it because it resonated with me, because it's true for me as well. I have a lot of passions, but I've got this weird, I guess I'd call it weird, animal thing, right? As I know some of us in the room do as well. And I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense from the standpoint of compassion, gentleness, and caring. And that is apparent about her all throughout. Another thing about her childhood that she talks about is obviously living in what she describes as de jure segregated Virginia. And that's just to be distinguished from how she describes living in segregated Concord, which is de facto, right? De jure is by law, you can't be together. De facto is this is just how it is, not by law. And she felt Concord was actually much whiter than where she lived in Virginia, right? So her experiences growing up in segregated Virginia didn't shape her as much as I would think they might have, right? Instead, she seeks to understand what's going on really versus the tale of a very caring white populace who had slaves that wanted to be slaves, right? And then who wanted to do the work, and everybody was engaged in this venture that was productive and wonderful. And now the North agitators are going to come down and screw this up for us, right? She was not so shaped by her childhood and the ways that she describes her childhood that narrative worked for her. And that's at a young age. That's not something that comes to her in the middle of her life. And so as she talks about her childhood, I love that. But some of the favorite scenes, I got to watch my time. Am I really already this far along? Goodness. All right, gonna move along. So, okay. Honestly, as I was putting stuff together, I was thinking, what? Will I talk the whole time? Maybe not. I should know myself better than that. I'll be up here all day. So some of the scenes that I really loved about her childhood were her summer on Cape Cod, where she describes riding her bike around and just reading a book a day from the library. And she describes the library the way I remember it. As soon as you read I don't even remember saying that about Miss Nancy. As soon as you read that, I could smell the room, right? I could smell the room where I was read Dr. Seuss. She describes the same thing. And you just love that feeling of being this voracious reader who is interested in so many things, and also a little bit of an ignored child, right? And that was true for me as well. And then the other scenes that I love from her childhood involve her school, where she's told that she needs to stop reading so much. Early reading is not a good thing, right? Like, why do we want early readers? This is trouble. This is going to hurt your brain. And when you go home this summer, you don't read a thing, you have fun. And she's like, yeah, no, read everything I can. You go have fun. I'm doing the reading. So that was one of my favorite scenes as well. When she talks about her education after grade school, and she's in boarding school in Concord, again, that little theme for me kind of snuck right in, that privilege theme. I'm like, she wrote about it without writing the words. I know how ridiculously privileged it was that I was in boarding school in Concord, and maybe Concord, Massachusetts. Maybe she didn't have to do that, but it felt to me like there was some unacknowledged privilege there, even as she talked about how her time there made her who she was, and again, to Peggy's point, started her removal from her family, right? And so she, one of the things, for the record, Miss Hall, for those of you who have read it, is like my spirit animal. I am absolutely in love with the woman who was running Concord Academy while she was there, and I have come to the conclusion that if we all had a Mrs. Hall in our lives, we would be able to conquer the world and do anything we want to do. And so even that to me is a bit of privilege. This woman was spectacular and very influential to her. Then in choosing a school, she was expected to be at one of the Seven Sisters, right? Because they weren't accepting women at any of the schools, the Ivy Leagues, where her brothers went or the people in her circle went. So again, my thought is, okay, she moved away from her family, but she didn't say, I'm not going to one of the Seven Sisters right now. She picked the one that would be the most controversial at the time for her, but she definitely stayed within the confines of her privileged life, moving from a boarding school in Concord to her school at Bryn Mawr. But in contradiction to what I just said, her time at both of those places were absolutely infused with activism. She wasn't one who just showed up and sat there. She engaged with the faculty. She engaged with causes. She went and saw Martin Luther King Jr. speak at, forgot the name of the brothers' school, St. Paul's maybe, at another school where boys boarded. And she was very interested in the topics of the day and writing with the scholars at the school. So it's not like she sat on her laurels. Same thing at Bryn Mawr, we see that. But what ends up happening as she talks about that and moves into her last 3 chapters is that we start to see the development of an activist, right? Even while she's in high school, her civil rights passion and movement really come about because she is interested immediately in an opportunity to go behind the Iron Curtain, right? And this is a time when that was really dangerous. And I was incredibly taken aback by how fearless she seemed. This is one of those moments where I was like, wow, I would have been terrified. I never would have done that, even with the same sense that must be done. Her fearlessness was so apparent in the book. And she talks about the fearlessness as being, for lack of a better word, idiotic, right? She even mentions that she was in a lot more danger than even she herself acknowledged. And so I think that that's a pretty cool thing to watch as she goes with Quakers, right? Remind you, she's an Episcopalian, WASP as deep as it goes, right? And she's going to, to East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia with Quakers, and her mother lets her go. And even she's astonished at this, right?
Privilege again, they feel untouchable.
That's a great point, Louise. I love that. Yeah, right. That is no one's going to hurt me because yeah, that's a great point. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I need to noodle that some. Because there's, that's, well, and hopefully that's what her mother thought. But honestly, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And even now, I think that's still a good statement. But I think part of her mother letting her go was right? I can't control her. I'm just going to let her go. This is ridiculous. And at least she's going with Quakers to that point. And then the following summer, she goes deep into the South to work on civil rights matters, right? She protests, she stays with folks that were parents of the Birmingham Four. I mean, there's so much of what she does. Even at the time, I think she recognizes the significance of it, but it's incredibly dangerous. And I'm stumbling a little bit because I'm thinking more about what you said, Louise. So much of the laissez-faire associated with leaving the station wagon and borrowing something from a friend is connected to privilege. When you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from, if you're going to pay tuition next semester, it's not as easy to be like, somebody else can type my paper. I'm going to, Birmingham or wherever the other town with an O, which I've forgotten, Orangeburg, I think, was, right? So I think that unacknowledged privilege weaves even deeper than I recognized. I love that. So in any event, as her activism grows into the civil rights movement, she, and by the way, I want to be clear because I think in her interweaving and my telling of it, I've done what she did, which is mix it all together. But remember, she was in high school when she went abroad behind the Iron Curtain through Checkpoint Charlie, right? And she was in high school when she went down into the deep South to protest and to help families and to participate in I don't think she did any of the freedom rides, but she was certainly there for the protests against the businesses that were not honoring the Civil Rights Act, right? So high school, it's amazing to me. And then as she moves through her college years, she still is paying attention to this and involved in it, but then the Vietnam War becomes the center of her attention. And what I find striking about that, and I'm going to move into my next slide just because there's a lot on it. What I find striking about that is how she is so anti-war and so focused on the atrocities toward children, and yet her lineage is so decorated. It is such an interesting contrast. And I don't think that the fact that she has family who fought in World War II, World War I, and the Civil War made her anti-war. I think this goes back to that deep-seated otherness that she felt from the get-go, that she knew she was different. She knew she would have a problem. She was very much pacifist. And as you move into the end of the book, you start to see how that becomes a problem for her and her activism. Because as the world is moving into a more aggressive, when I say world, I mean the world of protesters, is moving into a more aggressive model of protest, she becomes disenchanted with that. You can see that she wants the same kind of activism based on pacifism, and it becomes problematic for her. So that would be what I would call the synopsis of the book. And the things that I loved, and probably some of this has come out, so I don't have to spend too much time on this, but I loved her writing style. I found it incredibly easy to read. If you haven't read it, it is definitely nonfiction that reads like fiction, really easy to read. She acknowledges that one of the things about her right away that becomes clear when she's in high school is that she's a good writer. She learns to write at Concord and she becomes a prolific writer. Her honesty about privilege I liked, but again, I struggled with maybe not understanding capital P privilege. It is funny, but not funny. I didn't know how to write that. I was trying to figure out, like, how do I articulate, and maybe I did, that it's not overtly funny, but it's clever and enjoyable. And I found myself smiling a lot while I was reading it. I love it when a book does that. She owned some of her failings, but didn't apologize for them. Some of her weaknesses. I like that. As I said, I could see her in so many experiences. I am going to spend more time on the inconsistency between her mom and dad, but I just want to talk for a second about, I think the thing that bothered me the most about the book is it probably could have been 100 pages shorter without so much historical detail. That's really the only complaint that I would make. I felt, and I don't think she can help herself, right? She's a historian who really felt that the reader needed, I'm assuming felt that the reader needed to see the intricate detail of the pedagogy, or not pedagogy, sorry, pedigree of her parents to understand her upbringing. I'm not sure I did, but it was interesting. But even as we move, like her conversation about Sputnik, and then when she was talking about the layout of the countries when she was abroad, not necessary. I think a lot of it for me got a little boring. That's literally the only negative thing I think I can say, truly. Because the next thing that troubled me, I know I'm coming up on time, so I won't read these, but you can see in, this to me was the biggest conflict as I read it, that she has, I would think she would have reverence for the women in her life that preceded her because of the struggles that they had, right? It's so weird. She talks about many things about their character that I found charming and incredible. And, you know, like her mother did some things before she got married, where she was in Kentucky doing some work in the hills and riding horses and bringing things to people who couldn't get them. And I thought, wow, right? Like I thought it was really cool given the time. And she talked about her great grandmother, Isabella, who seemed like a really cool person too. And then in like the next sweep of the pen is talking about how they didn't see their potential. And so, you know, if you wanted to see these paragraphs in comparison at a later time, that's what they show, that she is talking with some degree of admiration, and then right in the same, you know, breath almost says, but, you know, I was different than them and they should have done more. And my mother didn't care about going to school and learning more. She wanted me to be a proper belle. And so that was, it bothered me. I can't say whether it's good or bad. I can't say, you know, whether it impacted her, whether she should have felt differently. Clearly, she has to write how she feels. But for me, to not have that respect for the women in her life felt inconsistent. On the contrary, her reverence for her father, I think, was misplaced. So she had this intense reverence for her father. And even when she talked about her heroines, Nancy Drew, Anne Frank, and Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird, she picked three heroines who didn't have mothers and who had these incredible fathers that play prominently in their relationships with them in their books, right? And so, and at some point she acknowledges that she gravitated toward women who had strong father figures. And that just kept clawing at me. I kept thinking, yeah, but you're a strong woman. And, you know, you are all about, you know, the roles that women play and breaking those roles. And I don't think that feminism plays as strongly as I thought it would in the book. As you noticed, it wasn't even a theme for me. Some reviewers have talked about the feminism in the book. It didn't pop up for me. Activism as feminism does. But her, you know, her reverence for her father, and this is a story I wanted to tell about animals. So she writes with loving adoration, in my opinion, I acknowledge it's mine, about how her father, the only time she ever saw her father use a gun was to shoot, or heard of him using a gun, was to shoot a dog in the house who was in pain from cancer. And then at a later time shot a duck, a family duck who had been beloved, which the imagery for that was beautiful until it wasn't, which was the point where he had to shoot the duck because it had been attacked. And then went on a rampage to find the offending possum, literally offending possum who attacked the duck and killed it. And the way she wrote about this violence with reverence continued to reinforce my belief that there's a really strong animal theme that even she herself doesn't recognize plays out in her life. So I thought that was interesting and cool and kind of inconsistent, which always makes reading a book like this really interesting. So now I'm at almost 1 o'clock. So I had some questions that came to me as I was reading it. I think I've actually hit on all of these to some degree. I wondered how much her intense privilege with a capital P, and now to Louise's point, yeah, even more than I wondered, enabled her to be who she was. Mind you, plenty of women and men who had that privilege who didn't do what she did. So it doesn't discount the work she did. But I guess for myself, when I sit there and say, oh man, you didn't do enough, I have to remember that there were times that my parents weren't sure they were going to make rent, right? Or mortgage. So I think that that does play into it. I said the thing about Miss Hall, which is the second one here. I wonder when she references the appalling silence of good people, how she would react. I scoured the web to try to find her reaction to Claudine Gay's resignation and her testimony before Congress, the woman who was, the African-American woman who was president of Harvard and resigned, was Claudine Gay. And I couldn't find any reaction by her. And so I found myself wondering how she would have answered Stefanik's questions that Gay was asked and how she would have reacted. And I was thinking about her pacifism and her openness to multiple points of view. And I'm not sure she would have reacted much differently. Speculating, obviously, but it's certainly, when you read the book, something to think about. I wondered if, given her trip behind the Iron Curtain in '63, would she consider going to Gaza today? Is that, I think the level of violence and danger is probably much more significant in Gaza right now. And you can tell that from reading the book, that it was less overt danger in what she was doing. But I wonder, would she advocate for her own child to do something like that? And then I'll end with this. The book ends in '68, and it makes me wonder what kind of activism we as a society should be pursuing today with regard to things like book banning. She's very much present in her writing that changing history is a major problem, right? And so this last quote, to me, it's very close to the end of the book, but really speaks to where she's landing in looking at her life in retrospect. So I'll close with the quote. Yet even in the nightmare of 1968, even as the Black freedom and student movements embraced violence and veered in directions I could not follow, even as American politics all but destroyed what Kit was her friend at Bryn Mawr, had described as our enduring but inaccurate faith in America, I remain glad to have had a time when I had a reason to believe, ideals to strive for, a glimpse of a beloved community. And I think she still feels that that exists today, and she can go back to it. Some of the words after that indicate that. But there's a nostalgia there that I didn't expect the book to end on. So, bottom line, 2 thumbs up. That's her. Anyone have any questions or thoughts they want to share?
What are you thinking about? That last quote.
Yeah.
The one that I wrote down is it's sort of a turning point in the life and after Selma and then
Yeah.
action thing. The quote was, it was no longer clear where a white person could fit in with the movements changing their perception.
Yeah.
And I thought it was, that remains a little bit for me. And it's where, what is a beloved community? I know we're looking for it, but what's the right place for us to live in?
Yeah.
She also said in that same section, it may be that oral empathy becomes more elusive as one ages.
Yeah. Well, I think you can even see that in that last quote. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. One of the other things, as you're talking about that, Peggy, that I was thinking of after reading it was, with regard to beloved community, I'm really worried about the world. I'm really worried. And I spend a lot of time, being worried. I'm worried for my kids and what will it look like for them. And reading this book actually gave me hope, because things were horrible during, the time of this book, and then they got better, and then they got bad, and then they got better. And so it made me recognize that they're probably going to get better. But what do we have to do now during the pain to make sure that it does get better?
So to that point, the other thing that I wrote down was most of us knew what SDS was. And the Huron state.
Yeah.
If we just leave nothing, then let it be known that we do so to avoid the.
Read that one more time, louder.
If we
Please.
appear to see the unattainable, then let it be known that we do so to avoid the unimaginable.
Yeah. That too is the book in a nutshell. Yeah, I like that you pointed that out. Yeah, very nice.
And it was nice to be reminded of those values where the SDS has gotten such a bad reputation.
Right, right. And to see it through her eyes morph. Yeah. Yeah. When she talked about not knowing where a white person fits in this struggle anymore, I couldn't help but think about her and was it Steve at the time? I'm not sure, staying with a Black family on a farm where they felt completely safe from the white mob. And even as I read that, I read it 3 or 4 times. I'm saying, so yeah, what, and so I wonder if at some point, and not wonder, must have stopped feeling that safety within the Black community because of the way the violence was turning, and many of the organizations were actually turning white people away. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Any other thoughts? As I melt right before your very eyes. No? Oh, go ahead, Barb.
And to follow up on that, and so that's part of what I really struggle with this one is. Genes for ally, but I, you know, I was for ally. The time that I'm looking at through eyes of today. You know, putting yourself in that position. I also think to be.
We do.
That, you know, often in welfare, you talk about, you know, being a voice for the voiceless. Maybe that's what she thought she was doing. Maybe because they could speak for themselves, they didn't have that power. Change.
I feel like there's a quote about that. I'll sit here and dig through it and waste time, but I feel like there was a quote about. It's not that one. It's, you know, how do I find anything when I've done this, right? As I'm reading it, I'm just gonna tab things that I want to go back and look at. And then I was like 3/4 of the way through and I'm like, yep, okay, very good. That's the way I highlight too when I'm studying, you know, okay, every single sentence is highlighted. That's not helpful. And then I start the top tabs to distinguish. I was really hoping I could find the one, but there is a quote in there somewhere, Barb, that makes me think of what you just said around the speaking for the voiceless, but not those words. So yeah.
And so I really struggled with some like her letter writing. And, you know, it felt sometimes an inflated sense of self.
This one, the one that she wrote after the Rotary meeting. Yeah, no, that was very defensive and self-important. Yeah, but I also was remembering her age. Right? Like her, yeah, I mean, her age is really her, you know, she's acknowledges I'm 17 and, you know, like her immaturity in responding to, you know, basically being accused of being an agitator with no understanding of the natural order of things, right? It is incredible how defensive she sounds and how, right, like to your point, the self-important, this is about me feeling good about myself. And right, and I struggled with the letter because it's not the tone of any of the rest of it. So interesting.
Why do you think she wrote it, and do you think she initiated it herself?
My take is that it was absolutely her, and that she was responding to having her feelings hurt and to being called out as a grandstander and immature, right? Like she was, and unfortunately her response looks like more grandstanding, right? But you know, she's 17, and you know, she both wanted. I get a sense from the letter, everyone to know how smart she was, but also how dedicated she was and why.
But the book, do you think she wrote?
Oh, the book. I'm sorry. I thought you meant the letter. I don't know. I think she said something about that.
She just felt that she knew was important. What do you think it is?
So my take would be that I think she says something in the epilogue, maybe, or in the beginning. I'm not sure, but my immediate reaction is people were interested in understanding her activism in that era. And she's a historian by nature. And that's one of my notes that I wrote to myself. I didn't put it on the screen, but this felt more like a historical take than a memoir. I think she really had, was reporting history more than she was reporting her own emotions. It's in there, but it's not as often. And so I think she probably felt that there was a hole in that area of understanding what an activist in that time, privileged activist, looked like, or what her life looked like. I mean, she served as Harvard's first female president. She served for 11 years, I think, something like that. And so she may only be known to a lot of people who don't take the time. I mean, even with the stuff with Claudine Gay, her name has come up, who don't, and she wrote this before that, to be clear, but who don't know who she was. Maybe she felt like the world needed to know, hey, I'm not just here at the ivory tower, you know, with all my money. I was also this person who was willing to put myself in harm's way.
Well, maybe also a reaction to the times we're in and people feeling powerless and
I like that too. Yeah.
you know, what you said is ultimately by the end of the book, you felt somewhat hopeful. So
Yeah.
I imagine that was
Or a call to action.
call to action.
Is it a call to action? I hadn't thought about that.
Talking about what worked and what didn't work as well, right?
Yeah. 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 I mean, you know, when the part about Selma, so I made a note somewhere, like, I just cannot believe the things she did, you know, seeing Martin Luther King Jr. speak twice, being at Selma and marching the second time around, being behind the Iron Curtain, being on the bridge, like all of the things that she experienced in her life. I completely forgot where I was going with that. Also a product of being a middle-aged woman in menopause. Well, it was important, whatever it was. Any other thoughts? Go ahead, Dusty.
The thing is also the sort of comparison of she like oh, the mother in Stain also revered wrote about it from different parts. Did she do that about? Did you notice her doing that about other women? Because I'm thinking to myself, like we ask a lot of our parents, why our parents do.
Yeah. It's hard when we find out they're human.
It's hard when it's hard when they sort of like close eyes down. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering whether women that she looked up to or as role models or something that they need to her relationship.
Other than her friend that she went abroad with the Quakers, and Miss Hall, I would say, yeah, she was hard on women. I mean, maybe not to the degree she was with her mother and her ancestors, but I thought she was hard on the president of Bryn Mawr. I thought, you know, there's a real difference between the freedom she enjoyed at Concord and the parietals that, is that how it's pronounced? I can't remember. Yeah, at Bryn Mawr, and her description of the president as not being as forward thinking as she would have expected. I mean, she all but says that. Right. And I think that that's a pretty hard take on someone trying to keep a school open for women with high academic regard at the time. Yeah. But she's, I mean, they're Mrs. Hall and her friend that she traveled with, and Kit all get high marks, but they're her contemporaries, right? Doing what she's doing too. Yeah. I guess she's hard on people who didn't act, who weren't willing to buck the norm. That's what's coming to me as we're chatting about it. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Thanks for letting me do this. This was really fun. It was a nice break from talking about torts and American federal government. It was a nice break for me to have something like this to read and to have a reason to read it deeply and tab it incessantly.
Soft media.
Oh, the freedom to versus freedom from. Oh yeah, I loved that. And I'm sorry I didn't talk about that because that's a big thing about her time in East Germany, where she recognizes that her whole life has been focused on finding justice in the world of freedom from. And what she recognizes while she's there is that there's, for a lot of people in the world, it's more of a freedom to do things. And is that what you're talking about, Barb? Yeah, yeah, I thought that was that's where the eloquent writing and the insight you could really see and enjoy reading. Yeah.
I was just. But what almost felt like she was like, nobody else gets this, only I get this
Mm.
distinction, like nobody else sees this, but you know.
Well, she even says as much about the trip. She's the charming one, he's the musical one, I'm the smart one. She writes that, like, I mean, in as many words. And so. Yeah, no, but she was at Selma. Oh my gosh. You're all invited to my dinner. Yeah, yeah, I felt at times like I was being too hard on her for being hard on people, but then I thought, I mean, I definitely more liked her than didn't, and more appreciate the book and the story she's telling than didn't. But I obviously am one person who feels like she should have done more with her life, right? So when I see that but then the privilege, right? The privilege. Any other thoughts anyone wants to share?
Good job.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.